Kalen chose to lay his cards on the table. The ultrasound sheet showing the gestational sac was 8 weeks old, having just returned. The child naturally wasn't his. Kalen sat across from him with a cold attitude. The time she cheated was 6 months ago. She refused to say who the paramour was, only that she was pregnant now and wanted to have this child and give him a name. Naturally, this meant she had to divorce him. He briefly suspected his own ears, unable to believe he had actually been played for a fool for half a year. But before he could utter a question, Kalen looked into his eyes, telling him that there was no need to speak, as she had already anticipated what he wanted to say. "You didn't hear wrong," he told her. He stared blankly at the woman he had loved for 5 years, his heart feeling like it had been pricked by countless needles, a searing pain spreading, making him feel as though he couldn't stand straight. He had never imagined his marriage would encounter problems. Kalen was beautiful, with a naturally cold personality and a slow-tower nature. She was famously known as a high and mighty goddess in school. Many boys liked her, but only he persevered, chasing her for 2 years until he finally won her over. He genuinely liked her. In all the years they had been together, even though she had never said words like, "I love you" to him, he had naturally assumed she had grown accustomed to his presence. Not long after graduating from college, they tied the knot. 3 years of dating, 2 years of marriage, and within this 5-year period, she cheated? He couldn't accept this fact immediately, and even wanted to find a reason for her infidelity. He wanted to say that he couldn't live without her, and even more, that he couldn't accept a divorce. But the words caught in his throat. Looking at Kalen's emotionless face, he stopped himself. He asked himself, if Kalen agreed to return to their family life after cheating, would he be willing? He was not. Of course, he wasn't willing. Kalen was pregnant with another man's child. She was stained. Too stained. She no longer deserved to be with him. After years together, Kalen still didn't understand how much he loved her. Perhaps because of this, after saying the word divorce, she grabbed her car keys and rushed out, leaving him alone to digest the news. She didn't return until the next morning. He had spent the entire night on the balcony, enduring the cool air, still unable to understand why Kalen would cheat. Kalen came from a decent family, and after graduating, she began to take over the gradually failing family business. This was precisely why her schedule had been packed these past 2 years. Working during the day and socializing at night had become the norm. He couldn't understand how she managed to find time to cheat while being so busy. Perhaps because he was also busy with work, preoccupied with his tasks, he spent too little time with her. But that couldn't be a reason for her cheating. When Kalen returned, she stood in the entryway, looking down at the scattered cigarette butts on the floor around his feet. Her expression remained unchanged, showing no sign of realizing the emotional blow her infidelity had dealt him. He stared at her across the living room. Her radiant beauty stood in stark contrast to his own wretchedness. He began to wonder why he should use her mistake to punish himself. After some time passed, he heard Kalen ask, "Have you thought it through?" Thought it through? Recalling the 5 years they had been together, whenever they had a disagreement, regardless of who was at fault, he was always the first to compromise. She had never once bowed her head. Not once. He gave a cold laugh, lifted his foot, and ground out the cigarette, but consciously ignoring the painful numbness spreading up his legs. Why? Why cheat? 7 years of acquaintance, 5 years together. He had imagined countless reasons why Kalen would want a divorce. Any reason other than cheating, he would have considered forgiving her. But she cheated, and cheating was the one thing he could not forgive. Kalen averted her eyes indifferently, her eyebrows showing a hint of impatience. "There's no why, Liam. The relationship has reached its end. Wouldn't it be better if we parted on good terms?" What a nice phrase. The relationship has reached its end. Let's part on good terms. All right. He managed to pull the corners of his mouth into a grimace. "We'll divorce." Perhaps because his agreement was too abrupt, not aligning with his usual bootlicking persona, Kalen looked at him in surprise for a moment, then moved her lips as if to speak, but ultimately said nothing. Because he had consented, the divorce process went smoothly. They didn't even notify their parents, rushing through the divorce certificate just as quickly as they had rushed through the marriage certificate. Regarding marital assets, he naturally fought for his property. He argued that his assets should not be given to his cheating wife and her paramour. Kalen was unwilling to compromise, but she was the party at fault in the marriage, and her connections in the city were far less than his. In the end, she reluctantly gave up most of the savings, only asking him to leave her the house. Her expression was somewhat resentful as she bit her lower lip. "Liam, you earn more than I do, and I still have to raise the child. At least leave me the house." He sneered. "What about your paramour? Can't he afford a house?" Judging by Kaylin's expression, she was likely hit by the truth. The house was their matrimonial home. Both families had contributed when they bought it, and he had put in the most effort. He calculated his savings and felt that continuing to argue over the house would be meaningless, so he ultimately agreed to let her keep the house, provided she made some concessions on their savings. Kaylin looked at him as if she didn't know him. Of course, she didn't know the man who no longer loved her. They had only been married for 2 years, so his luggage wasn't extensive. He carried his bags and left without looking back. Kaylin looked at his departing back without any sign of distress. This was the moment he suddenly realized that he had been wondering what kind of man his cheating wife had turned to, sinking to the lowest thing he had ever scorned in his life. He finally restrained himself from looking. Since they were divorced, not bothering each other was the greatest respect for their former relationship. The day after the divorce, he received a WeChat message from Kaylin's cousin, telling him that she had seen him and Kaylin's cousin go home together. The message was followed by 3 giggle emojis. He stared at the line of text for a long time. He replied coolly, "That's none of your business. You should ask your cousin." After sending the message, he promptly deleted Kaylin's cousin's WeChat. Kaylin's cousin had never liked him, and sending that message was clearly meant to make him uncomfortable, so why should he allow her to succeed? Standing on the bustling street, he suddenly felt lost, as if he couldn't find the way back home. At this moment, he realized that perhaps it was time to leave this city. The next day, he submitted his resignation to the company. After years of hard work, he had carved out a place for himself in this city, but now he suddenly didn't want to stay. The reason he came to this city in the first place was Kaylin. Thinking back, a short span of his early life had revolved almost entirely around Kaylin. No wonder she was tired of him. After quitting his job, he spent a month checking out the city's sights and closing his accounts before finally packing his bags and getting ready to head to his destination. 2 hours before his flight, Kaylin suddenly called. They hadn't been in contact since the divorce a month ago, and he hadn't expected Kaylin to actively reach out. After a moment of hesitation, he answered. Kaylin's flat voice came through the receiver. "I heard you're leaving the city." He mocked. "Your news travels fast." There was a period of silence on the other end, and then Kaylin coldly said, "Suit yourself," and hung up. To be honest, if this had happened before, and Kaylin had used this tone with him, he would have prepared her favorite gift, gone to her company building, and begged her forgiveness. Times had changed. She still thought he would tolerate her as he had before. Hilarious. He stared at the phone screen expressionlessly, then walked to a nearby service center and canceled his number. From now on, he didn't want to have any connection with Kaylin. He was born in a small county town, where life wasn't as fast-paced as in many cities. When his grandmother, who was over 80, saw him, she held his hand and repeatedly said he hadn't been eating properly and had lost weight. He slowed his steps, walking home in the evening sun, just like when he was a boy. Looking at his grandmother's gray hair and hunched back, a sense of melancholy belatedly crept in. In all those years he was chasing Kaylin, how many times had his grandmother lingered at the village entrance, waiting for him to walk down the familiar path? He was raised by his grandmother, and he hadn't told her about the divorce or his decision to leave the city. Thus, on the 10th day after his return, the neighbor came to his grandmother with a phone, and when she looked at him with a complex expression, he immediately understood that the call was from his parents. His mother's furious roar came through the phone. He hung up expressionlessly. When the phone rang again, just after he said hello, the volume of the roar was even louder than before. He hung up again. After 4 or 5 such calls, his mother finally calmed down, no longer shouting, but asking for his new phone number. She demanded to know what he was thinking, divorcing without telling them. He pursed his lips and calmly told her, "I've been divorced for almost 2 months. This time, what do you want to tell me, or what do you want to ask?" The other side was momentarily speechless, and then silence fell. When he was small, his family's financial situation was poor, and his parents decided to go out and make a living, leaving him to be raised by his grandmother. A few years later, they made some money, but they also had a new child, a younger brother. The reason for having a younger brother was because he was deemed useless. Later, during his summer vacation, they tried to bring him back and cultivate a relationship, but his brother was 6 years old at the time. At that age, he was already past the age of fighting over toys, but his brother, whom he had barely seen, was full of malice toward him. He casually tossed his brother's Ultraman toys onto the sofa and table, and when his parents came home from work, some of the toys were missing arms or legs for some reason. His brother cried silently, hugging the broken Ultraman toys. His parents' favoritism toward his brother was obvious. Sure enough, his parents looked at him with complicated expressions, and he struggled to explain that he hadn't done it. He still remembered the feeling of despair at that moment. His mother waved her hand, her attitude perfunctory. All right, I know you didn't do it. Then, when she thought he couldn't hear, she turned to his father and whispered, "How did your mother raise this child?" His father didn't say anything, clearly tacitly agreeing. Later, they bought more toys, but they were all locked in a storage room, with the key only accessible to them three. His grandmother knew best, and their dinner table never featured any seafood because he was allergic. Before he was brought to live with them, his grandmother had repeatedly told his mother that he couldn't eat seafood. Yet, on his third day in their home, he was rushed to the hospital after a bowl of seafood porridge. While in the emergency room, he overheard his parents arguing just outside the door. "How was I supposed to know he's allergic to seafood?" his mother said. His father's voice was filled with helplessness. "Didn't she tell you that many times?" "She told me so many things. How am I supposed to remember it all?" his mother retorted sharply. "Besides, he's so old. Doesn't he know what he can and can't eat?" He was just greedy, and his brother wanted to eat, so the rest of the conversation became inaudible. Now, they were so angry, not because he hadn't told them about the divorce, but because he had quit his high-paying and stable job. They were afraid that without a job, he would come back and compete with his brother for the family inheritance. Otherwise, how could they suddenly remember to call him? Perhaps because the matter was so important, his parents rushed back that same evening. Following them was his college-age younger brother. Their eyes met, and the gleam of schadenfreude in his brother's eyes was not quickly hidden. After more than 2 years apart, his parents seemed to have aged a lot. Wrinkles were clearly visible even when they weren't smiling, and his mother's face, in particular, looked a bit harsh. His mother ignored his grandmother's enthusiastic greeting, coldly glancing at him without sitting down. She rebuked, "Liam, your wings have grown, haven't they? You didn't even consult us about such a big decision like divorce and quitting your job." His grandmother was shocked by the news, her lips trembling, but she ultimately said nothing. Knowing their shallow affection, he didn't let the anxiety show, just held a half-smoked cigarette and remained silent. His mother couldn't stand this sight and flared up. "Liam, this is the attitude you show your own mother? You've always been poorly behaved. No wonder your wife left you." Seeing her words becoming increasingly harsh, his father quickly pulled her arm. "You've lost your mind. How can you say that about your child?" His mother realized her slip of the tongue, but couldn't bring herself to apologize, so she just turned her face away. His father looked at him awkwardly for a moment before turning back to his mother. He was the one being scolded. Why? Were children inherently indebted to their parents? His grandmother brought tea and whispered to his mother, "Calm down and talk nicely to the child." His mother gave her a disgusted look. "Liam has the nerve to do this. It's all because you spoiled him." She was always fond of using his grandmother as a scapegoat, and his grandmother always silently endured it. He tossed the cigarette butt on the ground, turned to his father, and asked, "How did you know I was back?" His father gave an awkward laugh. "Kaylin called us. She said she couldn't reach you and was worried." He pursed his lips, suddenly finding it ironic. She was the one who cheated, who was pregnant with another man's child, and who insisted on parting on good terms. He hadn't bothered her, and since they were divorced, he intended to cut all ties. Yet, she kept contacting him. His mother continued to chatter on, praising Kaylin's virtues. She said Kaylin's family background was good, and her character was terrible, but Kaylin was willing to tolerate him, and so on. He listened expressionlessly as she used him as a negative comparison to Kaylin, concluding that he must be mentally unstable to divorce and quit his job for the sake of divorce. Yes, anyone with a normal mind wouldn't go through such trouble. he was still somewhat resentful toward his parents. Regardless of his mother's harsh words, he was determined. The job was gone, it was gone. He hadn't found the answer he was looking for in the night's cold wind. He realized that the rest of his life was too long to waste on someone who didn't love him. Finally, his mother, still unwilling to give up, suggested that his job gap wasn't too long and he should strike while the iron was hot and find another job. His father agreed with this proposal, and they both urged him to quickly find another job, saying that his major wasn't relevant to the family business. And to avoid a conflict over the inheritance with his brother, they hoped he would find another job to secure his future. He pressed his throbbing temples. "Have you said enough?" Both his parents turned to look at him at the same time, and his brother, who had been engrossed in his game, also looked up in surprise. For so many years, he had been known for his good temper, and he had never openly questioned his parents' decisions. This was why his mother could be so reckless in demeaning him. But today, he suddenly didn't want to endure it anymore. He didn't want to beat around the bush and simply said, "If you're done talking, you should leave now. You can still catch a return ticket." His mother's eyes widened, and after a long moment, she burst into curses, calling him an ungrateful wolf. He glanced at her, stood up, and walked out. The truth was, indifference was hereditary, and his indifference was inherited from them. He found a small guest house in the town to stay in. The next day, Kaylin called him. She had somehow found his new number. He stared at the 11 familiar digits, but didn't answer. Kaylin was persistent and soon sent a second, a third. Her patience with him after the divorce was significantly better than when they were married. But this persistence he couldn't stand. When she called for the 7th time, he finally answered. There was no sound on the other end, only Kaylin's steady breathing. He didn't speak either, just looked down at the changing call timer. Just as the timer was about to tick past 2 minutes, he interrupted the silence. "Part on good terms, those were your words. I don't have the habit of staying connected with my ex-wife, Kaylin. Whatever it is, it's over." The other side remained silent. He didn't wait for her reply, hung up, and immediately blocked her number. Kaylin had never been very kind to him, even when they were married. Now that they were divorced, why was she actively contacting him? What was this? Was she uncomfortable with suddenly losing her fan? That was possible. After all, he had Ed on her for 5 years. He understood his parents. They came from poverty and now didn't want to go back. They had no genuine affection for him. Since the family business needed them, they would at most stay for 2 or 3 days. The best way to avoid them was not to go back. He turned off his phone and stayed in the town. On the 7th evening, his grandmother, leaning on her old cane, stumbled toward him. The octogenarian walked with short, slow steps all the way from the village to the town. He could almost picture her asking for directions all along the way. His grandmother's gray hair reflected the orange glow of the sunset, and her toothless mouth smiled at him. "They've gone. Grandma is taking you home." He suddenly remembered his childhood when he would stand at the village entrance, no matter how late his night class was, waiting for her to take him home. He thought he had weathered all storms and should be emotionless, but looking at his grandmother's stooped, almost 2 head shorter figure, he couldn't help but feel his eyes well up. After returning home with his grandmother, he finally turned on his phone. As expected, both his parents had sent him long essays, filled with veiled complaints about his supposed immaturity. He didn't even bother to open them. Kaylin also sent him a message using an unfamiliar number, urging him to live a good life, as she was doing the same. After all, they had been a married couple, and she wouldn't contact him again, wishing they could both move on. To be honest, he naturally didn't wish her well. He couldn't bring himself to bless the woman who had betrayed their marriage. However, the 7-figure balance in his bank account was enough to give him the courage to see the vast rivers and mountains, to witness sunrises and sunsets. On the 3rd day of traveling with his grandmother, they met a senior from his high school, UMO. He vaguely remembered that she was a top student with striking beauty and a well-proportioned figure. She was the goddess of most of the boys in their dorm, but he had heard she was a bit reserved, with few friends, and didn't like to get too close to people. He hadn't had much contact with her in high school, but he knew who she was. Later, they attended the same university, and though he had seen her a few times, they were barely acquaintances. UMO was carrying a camera and a simple backpack, traveling alone. Unlike her previous sickly fair complexion, her skin was now a healthy wheat color, and her well-developed figure was only partially concealed by her loose sports clothing. Unlike Kaylin's aggressive beauty, hers had a gentle charm, a softness that made people want to sink into it. Meeting an old acquaintance in a strange land, coupled with their similar destinations, they decided to travel together. Umo was quiet, but was very respectful of elders and knew how to make his grandmother happy. His grandmother liked her very much. One evening, he and his grandmother were sitting together, watching the stars outside the window, when his grandmother suddenly said, "Umo is a good child." He immediately understood his grandmother's meaning. She is indeed very nice. Older people were often very sensitive about matters of the heart, but there was a gap between him and Umo that was difficult to bridge. He admired her, but that didn't mean he had the capacity to love others. Moreover, he was divorced. He couldn't possibly be worthy of her. His grandmother was old and needed a few days to rest after arriving at each new location. He was worried that this would delay Umo's journey and suggested she go on ahead. Umo didn't refuse his suggestion, only smiled and said, "We can separate at the next stop. I also want to stay here a few more days." The misty town of Jiangnan was breathtakingly beautiful. Surrounded by such scenery, his mood brightened considerably, and he couldn't help but look at Umo a few more times. He already knew she was different from Kaylin's striking looks. Her beauty was delicate and moving, her features soft. She had an aura of scholarly refinement, making her seem like a very approachable person at first glance. Noticing his gaze, Umo smiled gently, the distant rolling mountains reflecting in her slightly curved dark eyes, giving her a look of openness and serenity. The winding ancient paths were shrouded in a thin layer of white mist, a scene right out of a fairy tale. He told his grandmother he wanted to go for a walk. His grandmother said she was too old and preferred to rest. She sat with several old ladies her age in the village. They spoke their local dialect, seemingly not caring whether the other side understood, and burst into laughter whenever they reached an exciting point. After watching them for a while from a distance, he heard approaching footsteps. He turned his head and saw Umo slowly walking toward him through the misty rain, holding an oil paper umbrella with a bamboo frame. She stopped beside him and offered him the umbrella with a soft gesture he had never seen before. Umo asked if he wanted to go for a walk together.